A faint echo of footsteps resounded through the marbled hallways of the palace as the clock struck midnight. The grandiose structure, bathed in moonlight, stood like a fortress of secrets, its towering walls whispering tales of power, privilege, and the shadowy lives that protected it. Hidden behind its grandeur were not just the royal family, but a legion of men and women who had pledged their lives to ensure their safety, the royal guards. To the outside world, they were stoic sentinels, embodiments of loyalty and discipline. But behind their impenetrable facades lay secrets so closely guarded they could shake the very foundation of the monarchy. Tonight, a storm was brewing, not in the sky but in the corridors of the unseen. Whispers circulated among the palace staff of something unusual, something no one dared to speak of openly. A new recruit, freshly sworn in, had inadvertently stumbled upon a piece of the puzzle, a fragment of truth the royal guards were desperate to keep buried. This wasn't just another tale of hidden passages or forbidden romances. It was a story that could change everything. The new recruit, a young man named Daniel, wasn't your typical palace guard. Bright-eyed and ambitious, he had grown up hearing bedtime stories about the royal family. Joining the royal guards had been a dream come true, a chance to protect the very people he admired. But his excitement quickly turned into unease. From the moment he donned the pristine uniform, he sensed an undercurrent of tension among his colleagues. The senior guards rarely spoke to him unless it was to issue an order. Their expressions were always guarded, their words measured. They acted like men who knew too much and carried the weight of their knowledge in silence. Even the seasoned veterans seemed to tread carefully, as if unseen eyes were watching their every move. Daniel brushed it off as nerves at first. After all, working in a place of such importance came with immense pressure. But that didn't explain the locked doors he wasn't allowed near or the cryptic conversations that halted whenever he entered the room. It was on his 5th night of duty when things started to unravel. Stationed in the East Wing, a section of the palace infamous among the guards for reasons no one cared to explain, Daniel noticed something peculiar. A flicker of movement in the shadows caught his eye. He turned sharply, his hand instinctively reaching for his baton, but there was nothing there, just an empty hallway lined with portraits of the royal lineage, their painted eyes seeming to follow his every step. He was about to dismiss it as a trick of the light when he heard it, a muffled sound like the faint hum of voices behind a closed door. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding. The sound grew clearer, words slipping through the cracks. If this gets out, it will be the end of us all. Daniel's breath itched. He knew he shouldn't be there, eavesdropping on a conversation clearly meant to remain secret. Yet something rooted him to the spot. Curiosity, or perhaps a sense of duty, urged him to stay. What could be so damning that even the royal guards feared its revelation? The voices stopped abruptly, replaced by the creak of a door opening. Daniel barely had time to step back into the shadows before two figures emerged. One was Captain Reed, the commander of the royal guards, known for his unflinching demeanor and sharp intellect. The other was a woman Daniel didn't recognize, her face partially obscured by a hood. They exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable, before parting ways without a word. Daniel's mind raced. Who was the woman? Why was she meeting with the captain in such secrecy? And what was it that couldn't get out? He wanted answers but knew better than to ask. In the world of the royal guards, questions were dangerous, and curiosity could be fatal. As the night wore on, Daniel couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. His fellow guards seemed unusually on edge, their usual banter replaced by terse exchanges and watchful eyes. He overheard snippets of conversations, words like protocol and containment thrown around with a gravity that made his stomach churn. Something was happening, something bigger than he could understand. By the time his shift ended, Daniel was no closer to the truth, but he had made a decision. Whatever the risk, he needed to know what he had stumbled into. Little did he realize that the answers he sought would lead him down a path of betrayal, conspiracy, and truths far darker than he could have imagined. As he left the palace grounds that morning, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He turned, scanning the empty streets, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the sensation lingered, a cold knot in his stomach that refused to loosen. Daniel didn't know it yet, but he had taken the first step into a world of secrets the royal guards would do anything to keep hidden. And once you're in, there's no turning back. The chill of the morning air clung to Daniel as he walked the cobblestone streets back to his quarters. The city was beginning to stir, the hum of life growing louder as merchants set up their stalls and workers went about their day. But Daniel felt detached from it all. His mind was a whirlwind of questions he couldn't shake. What was Captain Reed hiding? Who was that hooded woman? And why did it feel like the walls of the palace were alive with secrets, pressing down on him, daring him to pry further? As he approached his modest lodging on the outskirts of the city, he couldn't help but glance over his shoulder again. The feeling of being watched had not left him. He scanned the streets, his eyes darting to every shadow and figure, but everything seemed ordinary. Still, his gut told him otherwise. Shaking his head, he unlocked the door and stepped inside, bolting it behind him. Daniel's room was sparse. A small bed, a desk with a single candle, and a chair that creaked if he so much as looked at it. He sat down heavily, his armor clinking as he leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Sleep was out of the question. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Captain Reed's face, stern and unreadable, and the shadowy figure of the woman disappearing into the night. He knew he needed to tread carefully. The Royal Guards weren't just an elite force, they were a brotherhood bound by loyalty and secrecy. Breaking that unspoken code could mean the end of his career or worse, but the nagging feeling that something was deeply wrong kept eating at him. He couldn't ignore it. Reaching under his bed, Daniel pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a notebook, its pages filled with scribbled notes and sketches from his time in training. He flipped to the back, where he had started jotting down observations from his nights at the palace. Most were mundane, shifts in patrol schedules, minor incidents, and the occasional oddity. But now he added something new: East Wing, midnight, Captain Reed, an unidentified woman. Key phrases: if this gets out, end of us all. The words stared back at him, stark against the page. He tapped the pen against the notebook, his mind racing. He needed more information, but he couldn't exactly walk up to Captain Reed and demand answers. No, he had to be smart about this, subtle, and that meant observing, listening, and finding someone who might know more without realizing it. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Daniel froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly he stood, his hand instinctively reaching for the dagger at his belt. He approached the door cautiously, peering through the small crack. On the other side was a fellow recruit, Sarah, her face pale and her eyes darting nervously down the street. Daniel hesitated, then unbolted the door and pulled it open. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" he asked, keeping his voice low. She stepped inside quickly, glancing around before answering. "I needed to talk to you," she whispered. "It's about last night." Daniel's stomach tightened. "What about it?" "I saw you," she said, her voice barely audible. "In the East Wing. You heard them, didn't you?" Daniel's blood ran cold. He had been careful, or so he thought. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, trying to sound dismissive. "Don't lie to me, Daniel." Sarah shot back, her tone urgent. "I saw you near that door. I heard the same thing. Captain Reed and whoever that was. You're not the only one who thinks something's wrong." Daniel stared at her, his mind racing. If she had seen and heard what he had, that changed everything. It meant he wasn't alone in this, but it also meant the risk was greater. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked cautiously. "Because I can't do this alone," she admitted. "I've been stationed at the palace longer than you, and I've seen things, heard things. Last night wasn't the first time something strange happened in the East Wing, but it's the first time I've had someone else to confirm I'm not imagining it." Daniel hesitated, weighing his options. Trusting someone in this situation was risky, but Sarah seemed genuine. She looked as uneasy as he felt, and her presence here was proof she was willing to put herself on the line. "All right," he said finally. "Tell me what you know." Sarah exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "It started about 2 months ago," she began. "I was on patrol near the East Wing when I heard voices come in from one of the rooms. At first, I thought it was just the royals or their advisors, but the more I listened, the stranger it seemed. They were talking about containment protocols, things that didn't make any sense in the context of guarding a palace." She paused, glancing at the door as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "I tried to ask one of the senior guards about it, but he shut me down immediately. Told me to mind my own business. After that, I noticed they started watching me more closely, changing my patrols, keeping me away from certain areas." Daniel frowned. It sounded eerily similar to what he had experienced in his brief time there. "And last night?" he prompted. "Last night was different," Sarah said, her voice dropping even lower. "That woman, whoever she was, she's not part of the staff. I know everyone who works in the palace, and I've never seen her before. She didn't look like a noble or an advisor, either. And the way Captain Reed was acting." Daniel nodded, his own unease mirrored in her words. "We need to figure out who she is," he said, "and what they're hiding." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "But we have to be careful. If they suspect us, we're finished. And this isn't just about losing our jobs, Daniel. People have disappeared for less." Her words sent a chill down his spine, but they only strengthened his resolve. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than either of them had imagined. And if they were going to uncover the truth, they would need to tread lightly and trust no one but each other. As Sarah stepped out into the morning light, Daniel felt a new sense of determination. The secrets the royal guards didn't want anyone to know were now his mission to uncover. But with every step closer to the truth, the danger grew. And in the shadows of the palace, someone was already watching, waiting for the moment to strike. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope, every step precarious and every glance over his shoulder a reminder of the risks Daniel and Sarah were taking. The palace was no longer just a place of grandeur and duty. It was a labyrinth of whispers and unspoken rules, where every locked door seemed to hold a secret and every senior guard seemed to carry the weight of something unspeakable. Daniel kept his head down during his shifts, his eyes and ears working overtime to catch anything out of the ordinary. The guards were more reserved than ever, their conversations clipped and their movements deliberate. It was as though an invisible cord bound them all, tightening with every passing moment. Even Captain Reed, always the picture of control, seemed unusually tense, his sharp eyes scanning the halls as if searching for cracks in the armor of their secrecy. Sarah, too, had become more cautious. She no longer approached Daniel openly, instead finding moments to pass quick notes or share whispered updates when no one else was around. The two of them had devised a rudimentary system, coded phrases to alert one another of suspicious activity and safe places to meet when the palace felt too oppressive. One night, Daniel received a slip of paper tucked into the edge of his locker. The handwriting was hurried but clear. Midnight. Storage room C. Found something. His heart quickened as he read the message. He burned the paper in the small oil lamp in his quarters, watching the edges curl and blacken until it was nothing but ash. Whatever Sarah had found, it was big enough to warrant a midnight meeting, and that meant it was important enough to be dangerous. When the clock struck 12, Daniel slipped out of his quarters, moving silently through the dimly lit corridors. He had memorized the patrol schedules, knowing exactly when to move and when to hide in the shadows. The storage rooms were in a seldom-used wing of the palace, their doors marked only by small brass plaques. He found storage room C at the end of a narrow hallway and knocked lightly, the sound barely audible. The door opened just enough for Sarah to pull him inside. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously to the corners of the room. She held a small, leather-bound book in her hands, its edges worn as though it had been handled countless times. "I found this in the captain's quarters," she whispered, her voice trembling. It was hidden behind a false panel in his desk. Daniel stared at the book, the weight of her words sinking in. Taking anything from Captain Reed's quarters was an act of sheer audacity and reckless courage. "What's in it?" he asked, his voice low. Sarah opened the book, flipping through pages filled with cramped, meticulous handwriting. "It's some kind of journal," she said. "But it's not just personal thoughts. It's records, meetings, names, dates, and codes. Look at this." She pointed to a page where a symbol was scrawled in the margins. A triangle within a circle, its edges marked with small, intricate designs. Daniel frowned. "What does it mean?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but I've seen this symbol before. It's carved into the stone above one of the doors in the east wing, the one we're never allowed near." Daniel's mind raced. The east wing again. Everything seemed to circle back to that part of the palace, as though it were the heart of whatever conspiracy they were uncovering. "We need to find out what's behind that door," he said. Sarah hesitated, her fingers tightening around the journal. "It's not just the door," she said. "There's more. Look at this." She turned to another page, where a list of names was written. Some of the names were crossed out, while others had small symbols beside them, triangles, circles, and lines. Daniel recognized a few of the names as those of former guards who had mysteriously left their posts without explanation. "These are people," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "People who worked here. Or people who got too close to the truth," Sarah said grimly. "Daniel, I think this is bigger than just the royal guards. This is something else, something darker." Before Daniel could respond, they both froze at the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. Someone was coming. Sarah quickly shoved the journal into her coat, and the two of them pressed themselves against the wall, holding their breath as the footsteps drew closer. The light from a lantern flickered through the gap under the door, casting long, dancing shadows. The footsteps paused outside the room. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a deafening drum. He could feel Sarah trembling beside him, her breaths shallow and quick. The handle of the door jiggled, and for a horrifying moment, Daniel thought it would swing open. But then the footsteps continued, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "We can't stay here," he said. "It's not safe." Sarah nodded, and the two of them slipped out of the storage room, taking separate routes back to their quarters. As Daniel lay in his bed that night, the weight of the journal's revelations pressed heavily on him. The symbols, the names, the cryptic notes, it all pointed to a web of secrets far larger than he had anticipated. And yet, the most terrifying part was the realization that someone else knew they were looking. The next day, the atmosphere in the palace was even more tense. Captain Reed's orders were curt, his gaze sharper than usual as he scrutinized the guards. It was as though he could sense the cracks forming, the threads of his carefully woven narrative beginning to unravel. Daniel kept his head down, avoiding eye contact and focusing on his duties, but he could feel the captain's eyes lingering on him longer than usual. During a brief moment of respite, Daniel found Sarah in the armory. She was cleaning her equipment, her expression focused but troubled. He approached her quietly, keeping his voice low. "We need to decode that journal," he said. "I know," she replied, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "But we can't do it here. It's too risky." "I have an idea," Daniel said. "There's an old library in the city. Hardly anyone goes there anymore, but they have records, old maps, books on royal history. If we can find something that matches the symbols or the codes, it might give us a clue." Sarah nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "When?" "Tomorrow night," Daniel said, "after our shift." As they parted ways, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The palace was a house of cards, and every move they made risked bringing it crashing down. But for now, the pieces were in motion, and the path forward was clear. They would find the truth, whatever the cost. The following night, the city was cloaked in a heavy fog, the kind that muffled sound and made every shadow seem alive. Daniel moved quickly, keeping to the narrow alleys and side streets as he made his way to the old library. The streets were unusually empty, and the absence of the usual nighttime chatter only heightened his unease. Sarah was already waiting for him when he arrived, her hood pulled low over her face. The library stood at the edge of the city, its towering facade worn and crumbling with age. It was a place of forgotten knowledge, the kind of building most people passed without a second thought. But tonight, it felt like a sanctuary, a place where secrets might finally give way to truth. "Did anyone see you?" Sarah whispered as Daniel approached. "No," he replied, glancing over his shoulder. "I was careful." She nodded, and together they slipped through the heavy wooden doors. Inside, the air was cold and musty, filled with the scent of old paper and decaying wood. Rows of towering shelves stretched into the darkness, their contents illuminated only by the dim light of a few scattered lanterns. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. They found a secluded corner near the back of the library, where a sturdy table and a few worn chairs offered a place to work. Sarah pulled a journal from her coat and set it on the table, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it to the page with the strange symbol. "I've been thinking about this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just a design. It's a mark, maybe a seal, something official." Daniel leaned in, studying the intricate lines and shapes. "It looks ancient," he said, "like it belongs to something older than the palace itself." They began searching through the library's collection, pulling books and scrolls from the shelves in a frantic attempt to find anything that matched the symbol. Time slipped away as they worked, the hours blending into one another. The deeper they dug, the more patterns began to emerge. Sarah found a book on royal genealogy that mentioned an ancient order tasked with protecting the crown, not just from external threats but from dangerous knowledge that could destabilize the realm. The text was vague, but it hinted at a series of forbidden chambers hidden within the palace, sealed with a mark similar to the one in the journal. "It has to be connected," Sarah said, her voice tinged with urgency. "The east wing, the door, the journal, it all fits." "But what's behind the door?" Daniel asked, his frustration mounting. "What's so dangerous that they would go to these lengths to hide it?" Before Sarah could respond, a sound echoed through the library, a faint but deliberate creak, as though someone had stepped on the floorboards near the entrance. They froze, their eyes meeting in silent alarm. Daniel quickly extinguished their lantern, plunging their corner of the library into darkness. They crouched low behind the table, straining to hear over the pounding of their hearts. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moved through the library, growing louder with each passing moment. "Someone followed us," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel reached for the dagger at his belt, his grip tightening around the hilt. The footsteps stopped, and for a terrifying moment there was only silence. Then a shadow shifted near the end of the aisle, and the glint of a blade caught the faint light from a distant lantern. They were not alone. Daniel motioned for Sarah to stay low as he inched toward the edge of the table, his movements deliberate and silent. The figure was moving closer, their steps cautious but purposeful. Daniel's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. They couldn't stay hidden forever, but confronting whoever it was head-on seemed like a gamble he wasn't sure they could win. The figure paused just a few feet away, their silhouette barely visible against the dim glow of the lanterns. Daniel tightened his grip on the dagger, readying himself for whatever came next. But before he could act, a sudden noise shattered the tension. A loud crash from somewhere deeper in the library. The figure turned sharply, their attention diverted. Taking advantage of the moment, Daniel lunged, catching the intruder off guard. The two of them crashed to the floor, the impact reverberating through the quiet library. "Run!" Daniel shouted at Sarah as he struggled to pin the intruder. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before grabbing the journal and darting toward the back exit. The intruder, dressed in dark clothing that obscured their features, fought back with surprising strength. Daniel barely managed to keep hold of the dagger, his movements driven by pure adrenaline. "Who sent you?" Daniel demanded, his voice a harsh whisper. The intruder didn't answer, instead managing to break free and shove Daniel backward. By the time Daniel regained his footing, the figure was already retreating, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared. Breathing heavily, Daniel glanced around, his heart racing. The library was eerily silent once more, the only evidence of the struggle a few scattered books and an overturned chair. He wasted no time in following the path Sarah had taken, his mind racing with questions. Outside, the fog had thickened, turning the streets into a maze of ghostly outlines. Daniel found Sarah waiting for him near the edge of the city, her face pale and her hands clutching the journal tightly. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm fine," he said, though his body ached from the brief scuffle. "Did they see you?" "I don't think so," she replied, "but we can't go back to the library. They know we're onto something." Daniel nodded, his mind already working through their next steps. The journal was their only lead, but now it was clear that someone was willing to go to great lengths to protect the secrets it contained. The stakes were higher than ever, and the answers they sought felt just out of reach. As they made their way back to the city's outskirts, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the game had changed. They were no longer just uncovering a hidden truth. They were part of it now, caught in a web of intrigue that was tightening around them with every move they made. And in the shadows, unseen eyes were watching, waiting for their next mistake. The journey back to their quarters was silent, the weight of what had just occurred hanging heavily between Daniel and Sarah. The streets were still shrouded in fog, the lamps casting faint halos of light that did little to break the oppressive darkness. Every sound, the distant bark of a dog, the creak of a shutter, made them flinch, their nerves stretched taut. It wasn't until they reached the relative safety of a deserted alley near the palace grounds that Sarah finally spoke. "We're being hunted," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whoever that was, they weren't just trying to scare us. They wanted us out of the way." Daniel nodded, his jaw tight. "This is bigger than just the royal guards. It's not about loyalty or secrecy anymore. It's about control. And we stumbled onto something they'll do anything to protect." Sarah opened the journal again, flipping through its pages as though searching for something that might make sense of the chaos. Her hands trembled slightly, and Daniel could see the strain in her expression. She paused at a page near the middle, her eyes widening. "Wait," she murmured, holding the journal up to the dim light. This isn't just a list of names. Look at the dates." Daniel leaned closer, his gaze narrowing as he studied the entries. The names were familiar. Former guards, palace staff, even minor nobles, but the dates beside them painted a chilling pattern. Every single one corresponded to a disappearance, a resignation, or an unexplained death. "They're not just tracking people," Daniel said, his voice low. "They're eliminating threats. Anyone who gets too close to the truth." Sarah's fingers brushed over the page, stopping at a name that hadn't been crossed out. "This one," she said, her voice shaking. "It's Captain Reed." Daniel felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "Reed? But he's part of this, isn't he?" Sarah shook her head. Maybe not. Maybe he's playing a dangerous game, trying to protect himself, or maybe he's next. The thought of Captain Reed, so commanding and unflinching, being a target in this twisted game of shadows was almost impossible to believe. But the journal didn't lie, and its implications were clear. "We need to confront him," Daniel said, the determination in his voice surprising even himself. "If he knows something, anything, we have to find out." Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting to the darkened palace looming in the distance. "And if he's part of this, then we'll deal with it," Daniel said firmly. "But we can't keep running in circles. We need answers." The next day, Daniel and Sarah carried out their duties with the same precision and care they always had, but the tension was palpable. Every interaction, every glance, felt loaded with unspoken meaning. Captain Reed's presence was as commanding as ever, but now Daniel noticed the subtle signs of strain. His clenched jaw, his sharp, searching eyes. When the opportunity finally arose, Daniel approached Reed in the armory, where the captain was inspecting the guards' weapons. The room was empty save for the two of them, the clinking of steel the only sound. "Captain," Daniel said, his voice steady but cautious, "I need to speak with you. It's important." Reed glanced up, his expression unreadable. "What is it, Guard Daniels?" "It's about the journal," Daniel said, keeping his tone low, "and the names inside it." For a moment, Reed didn't respond. Then, with a deliberate motion, he set the sword he was examining on the table and turned to face Daniel fully. "Follow me," he said curtly, striding out of the armory without waiting for a response. Daniel followed, his heart pounding as Reed led him through a series of corridors and up a narrow staircase to a small, unassuming room. Inside, Reed shut the door firmly and turned to face Daniel, his expression as sharp as a blade. "You've been digging where you shouldn't," Reed said, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you have any idea what you've gotten yourself into?" Daniel held his ground. "I know enough to realize this isn't just about the palace. It's about something much bigger. And your name is in that journal, Captain. Why?" Reed's eyes flickered with something. Anger, fear, or perhaps a mixture of both. He exhaled sharply, his shoulders tense. "You think you're uncovering secrets," Reed said, his voice dropping even lower. "But what you found is only the surface. This isn't a conspiracy, Daniels. It's a war, a silent one. And if you keep pushing, you'll end up just like the others." "Others?" Daniel pressed, his pulse quickening. "The ones whose names are crossed out." Reed's gaze hardened. "They were brave, but they were foolish. They didn't understand what they were up against. If you and that girl you've been working with are smart, you'll burn that journal and forget any of this ever happened." But before Daniel could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hall. Reed's head snapped toward the door, his hand moving instinctively to the hilt of his sword. "They're coming," he said, his voice urgent. "You need to leave. Now." "What about you?" Daniel asked, his voice rising with concern. Reed didn't answer. Instead, he opened a hidden panel in the wall, revealing a narrow passageway. "Go," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "And don't look back." Daniel hesitated for only a moment before slipping into the passageway. As he moved quickly through the dark, narrow tunnel, his mind raced with questions. Who was coming? And why was Captain Reed helping him now after everything? When Daniel emerged into the palace gardens, Sarah was waiting for him, her expression anxious. He quickly recounted what had happened, his words tumbling out in a rush. "He said it's a war," Daniel finished, his voice tight with urgency. "And he's part of it, whether he wants to be or not." Sarah's face was pale, but her eyes were resolute. "Then we're running out of time," she said. "Whatever's behind that door in the east wing, it's the key to all of this, and we need to get there before they do." Daniel nodded, the weight of their mission pressing heavily on his shoulders. The palace, once a place of order and duty, was now a battlefield of secrets and lies. And as the shadows closed in around them, one thing was clear: the truth would come at a cost, and neither of them could predict how high it would be.